Here's another episode of what it's like to go to war. And on this episode, I want to talk about leadership in the middle of a firefight. If you know anything about history, you know that the way that we fought wars has radically changed over the century. From the bow and arrows and the castles to the Napoleonic Wars, where huge armies marched elbow to elbow across an open field, to the average battlefield today, which is now in streets and around alleyways, or perhaps in jungles and on mountain ridges. And war has changed, but as a result, the way that leaders lead in combat has changed. And this video isn't just for leaders, it's for every warrior, because the truth is the hardest person to lead in a firefight is always yourself. I've talked in several other videos about these persistent fears that every human being deals with in combat. The fear of death and the fear of letting your buddies down and the fear of the enemy. And I'm not going to go over all of that stuff again. But the type of leader that it required to be on a horse with a huge column of warriors behind you, marching 2 or 3 ranks deep, elbow to elbow, as you crossed an open field and you could see the enemy in their eyes, and you knew that in a few moments we were going to level muskets at each other, and a lot of people were going to drop every time there was another volley of fire from the muskets. That kind of leadership was intense, and it took a lot of prodding in order just to get warriors to be able to lead and to follow across those huge open fields. I won't go into all of the details of the intense courage that it takes to march elbow to elbow until you could see your enemy within close range of one another and take a knee or stand up and start to volley fire, musket fire across an open field. But many combat warriors were trained centuries ago in those Napoleonic tactics to lead from the front, quite literally to show your courage by being in front of your enemy, in front of your troops, and to place yourself between your forces and the enemy forces. It's a little bit more complex now on battlefields that are asymmetric, which means there's no front lines, there's no good guys here and bad guys there. Bad guys are all around you. The kind of lead from the front challenges that it took to free up the city of Fallujah in Iraq when you were surrounded in every direction by insurgents was intense. The kind of lead from the front challenges that it took to take a long-range patrol deep behind enemy lines in Vietnam when everything and everyone around you wanted to kill you was intense. The kind of lead from front battles that happened at the top of Roberts Ridge in Afghanistan when you're surrounded by enemy and there's nobody to back you up within 100 miles. That kind of fight is intense, and that kind of leadership is far more complex. It's not more courageous. It's not more or less courageous than the kind of leadership that it took to march elbow to elbow across an open field. It's just a lot more complex because the enemy are all around you. And because it's more complex, one of the essential roles of a warrior in combat, one of the absolute essentials of being a leader in combat, is to remove as much complexity as possible, to make it very clear for your forces what the mission is and how to succeed. Because when you take the enemy and the terrain and the weather and 50 other factors into consideration, it can get so complex that it's overwhelming, and there are so many variables, it's almost impossible to be able to make a decision. And in combat, decisions are made in split seconds, and combat decisions usually cost people their lives, your people or the enemy's people their lives. So one of the challenges of combat leadership is to remove as much variables as possible and make it as simple as possible. I don't know where the next war is going to be fought. Maybe it's going to be fought in the Ukraine. Maybe it's going to be fought in Gaza. Maybe it's going to be fought in the jungles of Venezuela or on open plains in Asia. I have no idea where the next war will be fought, but I do know this: the next war will be every bit, if not more complex than the last one, and a leader in combat is going to have to simplify their role for themselves first, because the hardest person to lead is always going to be you, but also simplify success for the troops that you lead, because when you take all of those factors into play and then add in the pressure cooker of fear, it can be overwhelming. It can be debilitating for most people. So one of the challenges of war in the modern age is the complexities of all of the variables that are at stake. I have incredible respect for those warriors that mounted a horseback or marched with their saber out in front of their troops with their standard bearer right next to them and walked across an open field directly into the teeth of the enemy. I have incredible respect for those kind of warriors. But the kind of warrior that it takes to be successful on the battlefield today, the kind of leader that it takes to be successful on the battlefield, has to process about 50 times more variables than that guy centuries ago. So my challenge to you in training, if you really want to prepare yourself for war, is to get really good at boiling down the essence of the operation and making it as simple for you and as easy to understand or simple for your troops as possible. Because if not, the complexities are frankly overwhelming. And this is what leadership looks like in a firefight on the modern battlefield. Just a couple of quick thoughts for you about what it's like to go to war. See you next time.